morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Methane e-Dialogues, Methane Emissions, Trajectories, and Pathways Ahead. We are looking forward to a really fantastic panel, and we have a great group of people in the audience. And just as everyone is coming in, a few quick things. On your right side, you'll see a little box with Q&A. Please, during the panel, feel free to post your questions there, and the moderator will look out for those. Please also mention your name and company so that we know who's asking the question. And on that note, also, before the panel starts, while we're just waiting for everyone and while I'm talking, feel free to mention your name right now, and just without a question, just your name, company, where you're joining us from, so that everyone has a little bit of a better idea of who is joining. And that way also you can connect after today's session. Talking about connection, just very briefly, a few words about Energy Dialogues for those of you who are not yet familiar with our organization. We're all about connection and partnerships and a catalyst for industry connections. And we do these through dialogues such as today's. We do these through in-person events. We do this through our Energy Dialogues collaborative membership and a lot of other ways. So we are really pleased for those of you who are regulars, welcome back. And for those of you who join us for the first time today, it's great to have you. And we look forward to working with you more in the future. And in that spirit of connection and collaboration, we have assembled a really fantastic panel today. I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have some great industry experts on methane, and can't wait for us to kick the dialogue off today. Before handing over, I just want to thank our sponsors, Project Canary and Validere. They are essential in making dialogues such as these happen. So thank you for your partnership and collaboration. And now I would like to welcome onto the virtual stage and onto the virtual panel, Connie van der Biel. She's the Academic Director of the Institute for Environmental Sustainability at Mount Royal University. Connie, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Monica. It's always a pleasure to be able to participate in Energy Dialogues events. You and your team do an amazing job, and I'm looking forward to our conversation very much. I just want to start in the spirit of reconciliation, just noting that the institute that I work at is located in Calgary, Alberta, which is in the traditional territory of the Niitsitapi and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation Area 3. So as the Institute Director, I'm really honored that I get to support faculty and students in research, learning, and engagement with the external community in this broad space of environmental sustainability. So like many of you listening today and participating, methane emissions is so important, and so important to this broader conversation of energy, that transition that many of us are engaged with. We're so fortunate, as Monica was saying, to have three highly accomplished and knowledgeable panelists with us today. So we have Andrew Baxter, who's the Director of Energy Strategy at the Environmental Defense Fund, Ian Burgess, co-founder and president of Validere, and Anna Scott, Chief Science Officer and co-founder of Project Canary. So I'm going to get us going and start off by just asking each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves, their organization, and maybe broad strokes, high-level perspective on methane emissions. And Anna, if I could, I'd love to start with you to get us going.
Yeah, thanks so much, Connie, for the great introduction. My name is Dr. Anna Scott, and I'm a co-founder and a chief science officer at Project Canary. And Project Canary is a Denver-based organization that does one thing: we collect trusted and independent data on climate. I think we're most well known for our work around specifically methane emissions, and a lot of what we do, but not all of what we do, is in and around the upstream sector. And we've built up a lot of expertise around collecting ESG data, managing that data, operationalizing it, and also utilizing that to help differentiation within the supply chain. Just as a quick note about myself, I have a PhD in earth science, which makes me a very bad geologist, but slightly better at understanding emissions. I've been developing algorithms and sensor technology for the past couple of years that are now in use out in the oil pad. I'm really excited today to talk about what we think is such an important issue, as the new IPCC report, as the latest UN report is showing. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. But it's one that is a fixable issue. And so we're excited to spotlight this issue and share some of the strategies that we've seen work in the industry to lower emissions.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Just amazing. I'm going to turn it over to Ian now.
Sure. So I'm Ian Burgess, co-founder and president at Validere. What we do at the core is that we build a universal data layer for inventory information across the energy supply chain. And the idea is that we want our customers to have as accurate, complete, and auditable information on their inventories, what you have, where it is, all the attributes that affect its value, and decisions that you will want to make with it, as at your fingertips, as Amazon has in their warehouses across their supply chain. And so, we've come into this space as a, really measurement experts, good measurement expertise and strong analytics expertise. And we see, with basically a whole bunch of parameters that didn't used to affect the value of a commodity that now affect the value of the commodity. And to echo Anna's point, I think one of the things that is interesting about methane that's also is a real opportunity is that if you look at all of the major sources of GHG, there are few that are as large and as solvable without completely changing the electricity grid as this one, methane emission reduction in the energy industry. And so I think it makes sense that you're really seeing a push industry-wide from the regulators and from the industry themselves to fix this. A little bit of background, I guess. So I did my PhD in applied physics at Harvard in, I guess, almost 10 years ago. I'm getting old. And my specialty was in optics and material science, and spent a lot of time in sensors to sensor technology, ranging from kind of the quantum computing kind of end all the way down to the more medical side. And so I guess, like the company, I'm fairly instrument agnostic measurement expert.
Great. Well, audience, as you can tell, two slackers on the panel today. So just brilliant, so technical, and so perfect for this session. I really like, Ian, the notion that there's some solvable problems here. In my world, that always leads to some optimism. So now, Andrew, do you want to say a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from and your perspective today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Connie. My name is Andrew Baxter. I work for the Environmental Defence Fund in their energy program. And in my role, I'm focused on industry and investor engagement around issues that the oil and gas industry face during the energy transition, particularly reducing methane emissions and flaring in their operations. A little bit about the Environmental Defence Fund, for those that aren't familiar. We're an environmental nonprofit. We're headquartered in New York City, but we have offices all over the globe. And we partner with leading companies, investors, and governments and regulators to catalyze environmental leadership and address a whole slew of environmental problems, including methane emissions. And I mean, I mirror what Ian just said. I mean, reducing methane emissions could be, in the short term, the most cost-effective, impactful step the world can take to address climate change. And the global oil and gas industry can take steps today with existing technology to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. So not only of the utmost urgency that we solve this problem, but it's also a really exciting area to work on, due mostly in part to the rapid pace of technological innovation and advancement. A little bit about my background. I'm a chemical engineer and spent my career before EDF in the upstream oil and gas industry. So I've seen a few methane emissions in the wild, in the North Sea, in the UK, and in the Middle East, and in the Arctic. But yeah, really excited about the discussion today.
Great. Well, thank you all. That gives us a nice sort of foundation to move forward. There are some guiding questions for this session, so I want to dig right into those. And Andrew, based on where you're coming from, I thought we'd start with you to talk a little bit about the drivers for methane reduction, including ESG, and then also a little bit about how things are changing, what the targets are or should be, and where you think you're headed. So we'll start with Andrew, and then I'll open it up to Anna and Ian to build on Andrew's comments.
I think Anna mentioned the IPCC report, but you just see an incredible focus on methane emissions from all sorts of stakeholders now. And as the world seeks to transition to a decarbonized energy system, oil and gas companies and their assets are facing increased risk due to policy, future policy changes, legal implications, market changes. So methane emissions from the oil and gas operations are an urgent and material business risk, and the world is waking up to that. So Connie, you asked about sort of drivers, and I think firstly there's a driver from customers, so customers care. We saw Engie late last year back out of an LNG deal, citing methane pollution associated with gas produced in the Permian as an unacceptable risk. We see that investors care. On so many investor or shareholder resolutions, but an example could be the recent Engine No. 1 re-energize ExxonMobil campaign, where methane was very much front and center in there. And financiers care. So JP Morgan, one of the largest sort of issuers of debt to the oil and gas industry globally, released their carbon compass, their Paris-aligned financing framework earlier this year. And for the oil and gas industry, they explicitly called out methane emissions and set a target of 75% reductions by 2030 for their portfolio. I think those are the three. There are so many drivers, but I think in the business world, like the most compelling ones are customers, investors, financiers.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to turn to you because in your opening comments, you did mention ESG and the role your organization plays in measurement and so on. And I think that fits into sort of what Andrew was talking about, but also broadly in terms of drivers. So I'll turn it to you, Anna.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I couldn't agree more with what Andrew was saying, that I think, we really do see this pull in the market coming from both the investors of oil and gas assets, as well as the end buyers, which, in the United States, one of the largest buyers is specifically utilities. That's, one thing I'd note that we at Project Canary are seeing a lot of interest in. So just as a note, I think on ESG, our organization kind of has like two products, one of which is we have measurement technology that we put on real-time continuous monitors at the pad level to get direct and continuous measurements of what those pad level emissions are, and then we combine that with a rating system that's kind of more of a holistic approach at ESG that looks at safety factors, water impacts. We just released some work on freshwater intensity usage today, air and community, and I think that whole sort of holistic picture is growing. I think in importance, but also in recognition within the market. That being said, I think emissions is really first and foremost, when I talk with utilities who are, and particularly in cold climates in North America, who are under tremendous pressure to meet net zero goals or aggressive emissions reduction goals, natural gas is a big part of their energy supply planning. And, I was talking with somebody the other day that was in a, we'll say an unnamed, really cold city up north. And she said, look, Anna, if we don't have natural gas, we'll die. We'll just freeze to death. And in that world, it's so critically important to get a handle on reducing the carbon intensity of that supply chain, as quickly as possible, as Andrew's talking about. So to go back to answer your question that you were posing, we see the tremendous pressure, like in other sustainability movements, we're seeing a lot of pressure is coming from the end consumers. And so while, we're really excited about that in the utility market, you might think that the investor trend is slightly different, but if you look at where a lot of the investment money is coming from, that's going into oil and gas, a lot of it's coming from pension funds. And so that end consumer pull is there as well. So I really see that consumers are demanding cleaner energy products, and they're demanding cleaner investment opportunities as well. And I think those are really kind of combining together to create two really great market forces. And I'm really excited about that because I think it offers both carrot and stick. And I think it's critically important that we offer incentives, positive incentives to get people to do better, as well as, sometimes the stick for people who are interested in, not being the first to move.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Ian, anything you want to add about ESG or targets or how things are changing from your perspective with respect to methane emissions?
Sure. I guess what I always think about is I think the way people talk about ESG today in the energy industry really reminds me of how people talked about digitization in 1999 and at kind of the peak of the dot-com bubble. And I think what you have is you've reached this threshold where it's become scarier to do nothing. Like, you're very scared of doing nothing, but you don't quite know yet what to do, right? And that's kind of generally what you see in, same in the dot-com bubble, right? The digitization is as much of an is a certainty now. Huge transformation is going to happen. We can't do nothing, but because we don't know what to do, there's lots of, fear. There's lots of potential for irrational investment, et cetera. And I think one thing that we really want companies to understand is that the number of ways this can play out is actually pretty finite, and therefore, and there are blueprints out there for what this is likely to look like that you can use to make decisions that you should have reasonable confidence are going to be good decisions, not just good at the standard of better than nothing, but good at the standard of likely to be impactful. And so one template we like is desulfurization, right? I think, we had a webinar the other day that was called Carbon is the New Sulfur. Methane is the new sulfur is probably even more apt in the sense that you can, just like you could desulfurize without completely changing the power grid and the internal combustion engine, you can also demethanize. But there's also things that you can learn from that as kind of, an example of a success story. There's things that you can learn from that I think the parallels will apply here. So one is step one. You want to get very good at measurement, and you want to understand. You want to get very good at understanding what you have, and you should be aware of the fact that likely the best way to measure what you have is going to be not the same in all of your fields, right? Just like you see, again, I use sulfur as an example, right? We have different sulfur standards for clean fuels as we do for crude. We have different vapor pressure standards for crude than we have for clean fuels. Et cetera, in terms of measurement standards, not emission standards. The second thing is that you don't want to create a siloed location for either this data or the decisions that you make around it. You don't, I always say, it's the sulfur emissions, SO2 emissions are down 10x in the last 30 years in the US, and exactly 0 companies today have a VP of sulfur who reports to the CEO, right? Instead, what happens is you get good at measurement and you integrate this into the normal bread and butter of your business, your business decisions, from your day-to-day marketing activities, your day-to-day CapEx investment decisions, your day-to-day operational activities, and your longer-term strategic planning. And in order to be able to do that with the current, the current climate, which is new, kind of on the pricing side, right? Carbon pricing is still relatively new. These methane incentives are new. The voluntary markets are new, right? I think it's worth realizing that even though these things are new and likely to change, over the next 5 to 10 years, right, as the incentives get more mature, the number of ways that this can possibly play out is actually pretty finite. And so I think you can make some pretty stable bets backed on solid data today that says, hey, I want to map what my emissions are everywhere, and then I want to understand how I benchmark against everybody else, right? And I want to understand what is the cost of CapEx I would need to reduce emissions, my methane emissions at each node in my system, right? I can do all those things today. And then you can input all those things into a model that takes, your carbon price and your different incentives, and it basically becomes plug and chug as to what you should do when. And you can model that under several different carbon pricing, several different voluntary market scenarios. And so I think it is actually not too early to start implementing practices that look like the blueprint for desulfurization, rather than just doing exploratory stuff. I think the number of variables are small enough that you can do this now.
That's great, and I think that's helpful to a lot of people participating today, in the sense of having, a pragmatic approach in mind that connects to something that's already existed. I think that's always a useful way to proceed. I wonder if I could just stick with you for a minute, because you talked quite a bit about market mechanisms as factors in this. What about regulations? It's one of the questions that we're covering today around the role of regulations to curbing methane emissions and how that will shape things moving forward.
So I guess I see a market mechanism as a vehicle to translate regulations into behaviors. And I do ultimately believe that every voluntary market mechanism is either reflecting regulations that exist today, for example, with European buyers, or Canadian buyers, right? Anywhere there's a carbon tax, or implicitly they're making a bet as to what regulations are going to be in the future, right? If you think about energy as a commodity, if there really were never any carbon pricing and never any regulation, at some point the voluntary markets couldn't sustain themselves. You couldn't sustain yourself competitively buying at a premium if that feedback loop was never closed. And so I think it's kind of like the regulations ultimately are what's going to drive the behavior here. And I think the markets have to do a good job, one, facilitating the regulations, right? And again, like sulfur is a good analogy, right? Ultimately, the regulations on sulfur content in fuels drives, pricing differentiation of commodities by sulfur content, right? And which drives behavior from the smallest operational decision all the way up to capex planning. I think you'll see the same thing that happens here. But I think what the market's role, I don't actually think in the long run the market is really setting any kind of behaviors or any kind of incentives independent of the regulations. I think what they are doing is they are facilitating the effective administration of existing regulations, while also making tradable in some ways bets on what the regulations are going to be in the future. And that kind of facilitation is also important because it takes a long time to build a lot of capex in these industries, right? So it's like you want to be able to have a market mechanism where people can invest and hedge, et cetera, against most likely future states of a regulatory landscape. I think that's very healthy.
Excellent. Anna, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond and say that I actually think that we're seeing things a little bit differently. I'm really not seeing that the regulatory push is coming. I think, certainly the environmental regulations are probably just going to come a lot slower than the market demand is. And I would say to companies who are starting to get their hands on an ESG strategy, I might humbly suggest that if you're waiting for a regulatory push from this, it's probably going to be too late. We're talking to utilities every day who are starting to talk about scaling up 100% of their 100% of their natural gas purchases to be lower emissions gas through certified gas. We're hearing similar things from about sustainable linked bonds and other things through the financing market. And so, I think, look, I went to University of Chicago. And so like the Chicago School of Economics and the efficient market hypothesis are, practically in my blood. But I just think it's coming from consumer demand. And, I just wanted to share the story of somebody who runs a municipally owned utility the other day, and who was talking to one of his suppliers along with us, and was telling them, hey, we just converted our coal plant into a gas plant. we think this is significant emissions reductions. And we went to our town and we said, hey, we did this. And we were expecting to be applauded. We were expecting like a statue, we were expecting a write-up in the newspaper. And instead what happened is we had all of, the local university professors show up and pick at us and say, hey, and they pointed to some of the latest studies out of the Permian saying some of this gas is worse than coal, and said, hey guys, like, we're not satisfied with this. And like, this isn't good enough. And, a whole host of things that, didn't make them feel great. And I think that, in the upstream sector, we're so disconnected from that downstream demand. So many of the buyers of this product are, they're working their way through the supply chain. And I think that that information, I see that information is not getting through. I hear a very different thing from the heads of utilities. Gas buying utilities that I'm hearing from the CEOs of oil and gas companies. And it makes me worry for some of these companies who aren't taking, who aren't starting down that ESG journey. So I totally agree with what Ian's saying about how it's important to get started on that. And I think there are great templates. The sulfur conversation is one, but I might humbly disagree and say, I think if you're waiting for regulation, I think you're going to be a little too late here.
Maybe just a quick thing to add to that, just to clarify on Anna's point. I totally agree that you shouldn't be waiting. I guess in some ways the message to regulators is that if the voluntary markets they exist today, and you have that means you have an opportunity and you have a stick today. But if 10 years from now those aren't followed up by regulations, I don't think the voluntary markets will be able to sustain themselves forever. And ultimately, to the other point you made, Anna, how do the regulations get made, right? Whether it's a regulation, by a state-owned utility or a municipal government-owned utility deciding what they want to buy, or it's by a formal EPA regulation, it's ultimately through the voters, right? And totally to second your point, I mean, the voters are increasingly demanding that we take emissions reduction seriously, and methane is, again, going back to the point that, it's an opportunity that it's easy, compared to other sources of emission, it's easy to take a real bite out of this existing technology. That also means there's no excuse, right, from a voter's perspective.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, I'm sure you have some interesting insights here as well, based on the work that you do.
Yeah, and I think there's voluntary markets are only going to be able to, or I only see them going so far. For example, the top, for 5% of the US gas producers to certify their methane emissions, to sort of sate the demand for low methane intensity gas at the moment, that leaves 95% of production outside of those realms and doesn't necessarily incentivize the worst actors to clean up their operations. And therefore, I think regulations that are all encompassing, that drive methane emission reduction from all parts of the industry, even the ESG laggards that sort of Ian pointed out, are critical. And I do think that regulation isn't quite as sluggish as we might imagine. I mean, the Biden administration has shown it's firmly committed to reducing methane emissions, and the EPA will release draft standards in about a month's time on setting standardized leak detection and repair protocols across new and existing sources. On the other side of the Atlantic, you see the European Commission will be coming out with draft legislative proposals at the end of this year, not only on leak detection and repair and flaring, but also on actually measuring the methane emissions. There'll be legislation being drafted on that this year. And so while that takes a while to make its way through the systems and get rubber stamped, I think industry realizes that the train is leaving the station. They can see it coming towards them, and they act to get out ahead in front of it and make sure that when all of these rules come into place, that they're not laggards and they're not left behind. So even seeing the regulation and the legislation on the horizon is forcing companies to sort of act today.
Yeah, I think you're all making the point that for companies, the need to be proactive and to get moving is clear. Andrew, I'm going to stick with you for a second because we do have a question from the audience that's related to regulation and also to how methane reductions, energy transition, climate change all fit within this broader social macro context that we're in. So the question is around whether there's the potential for methane fees connected to regulation being developed for reconciliation legislation. And I may not be a question we can answer in this panel, but Andrew, maybe do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not on the team that work on methane fees, but I have heard it being spoken about. What I might add, because that's very unsatisfying for whoever asked that question, but we see that this discussion, especially in Europe, who are one of the largest importers of natural gas in the world, like what would sort of a carbon border adjustment be for high methane intensity fuels that are being imported into the Union? And some folks might call that an import standard or a performance standard. But sort of how can you, like, Europe consume all of this natural gas, but it's all produced out with its borders. So folks are thinking about how do we create incentives to make sure that we can reduce our supply chain emissions and our natural gas supply chains as we decarbonize our energy systems. So Europe have signaled that they want to get away from using natural gas, but whilst they're doing that, they know that they have to reduce methane emissions from their supply chain. So, and then consider other massive importing regions like Korea or Japan, and then the exposure that countries like the United States or countries in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, their exposure to these markets, and these markets thinking about like a carbon border adjustment on methane. This is another sort of signal for folks to sort of act today.
Okay. And I'm going to turn to you now and talk about the metrics that need to be in place. And you mentioned a bit of this again in your opening comments, but what's needed to report accurately and meaningfully on methane, and then connecting that to solutions? Is there a global approach? Is it more regional? What's your experience in general around measurement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my opinion and our approach has been that direct measurements are needed here. I think initially I was approaching this as a scientific problem, and as a scientist, saying, okay, what's the detection limit? Like, what's the cost optimization? And what I've learned from speaking with broader segments of the market, including investors and the buyers of this, is that it's not just about how can we most cost effectively be able to have a good measurement program. What's important here is how we can communicate to folks who are taking on risk and exposure in this, whether they're buyers or investors, that we have the best and most comprehensive answer. And because so many of the emission sources in the oil field are intermittent, in my mind, this really calls for continuous direct measurement directly on the facility. So, at Project Canary, we do make our own hardware. We are hardware agnostic. We are working with other hardware providers in order to make that happen. But I think really continuous and direct measurements are going to be critical to communicate to really skeptical stakeholders that have, quite frankly, some of them been burned in the past, and who need to have really good assurances that if we're to differentiate the supply chain, which I think is absolutely critical, we need to have the measurements that are capable of doing that, but not only capable in a scientific sense, but something that stakeholders can explain to the folks who are like utility customers, the general population, the general public. And so in that world, I think it's so great when companies come to us and they say, hey, we're doing flyovers once a year, or, we're looking at some of this like NASA satellite data. And that is really great and really important. And what we say is this is a yes and moment. Those are catching your really big leaks. But those, we're going to need to see more, and people are demanding you to catch more. And that's going to demand higher accurate measurements and measurement capabilities that are there a lot of the time.
And if I could just ask you, where are we in the adoption of those approaches?
Yeah, so it's come a long way since when I first started pitching this idea, and people are like, "Are you sure the industry is going to be really into this?" And I was like, "No, no, no, like trust me, like wait a couple of years and this will be great." So, whereas I think just a few years ago, this was really sort of starting out. A lot of R&D groups and in the super majors were starting to think about this. I think today this is a little bit more of honestly, this is a lot more of a mainstream idea. We've had companies announce that they're moving towards continuous monitoring, including at 100% of their facilities. So for example, a few months ago, we had an announcement with Southwestern Energy in the Marcellus announcing that they will be moving to 100% continuously monitoring their Appalachian production. And that's not overnight, that's not, we're going to snap our fingers and do it. It's going to, it's boots on the ground and we're going to roll it out. But I think it's one of many data points that indicate that the industry is moving towards this. I would also say, again, not to hit too hard on the certified gas front, but we are seeing a lot of adoption of direct measurement technology on that front, whether it's our own Trustwell certification, whether it's some of the work we're seeing coming out of S&P and Global Platz's new methane exchange that they'll be announcing more of in October.
Okay, great. Ian, do you want to jump in on this idea of measurement?
Sure. So I guess the way I always think about this, and again, this applies to emissions as much as it applies to everything else that you want to measure. I think you need to have an understanding of your uncertainty, and you need to have what we call a chain of proof that allows you to validate your measurement, right? And that really needs to be paired with whatever equipment you have. And so if you think about understanding your uncertainty, right? One area of uncertainty that many locations have is time uncertainty, right? That you have intermittency. And so if you are making a measurement that is, a point flyover, then you have, potentially, everybody seems frozen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're still good.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
That's good. Sorry. So you have potentially, some uncertainty associated with that measurement in the raw form, and then you have a lot of time uncertainty. But if how you can reduce that uncertainty is you want to make sure that you have a corroboration of multiple different ways to sanity check the same thing, right? So an example. And there's really a lot of these companies, they have a lot of equipment already that can really do that, right? So an example, let's say that you're looking at, pneumatic actuators, right? There's like the 0th order way to measure your emissions, which is you say, hey, on average, industry-wide, the EPA says they're on this much percentage of the time and they leak this much. And so we're going to say, we're going to count how many actuators we have, and we're going to put a number there, right? And that will have uncertainty in a lot of areas. Now, many companies have these actuators actually plugged into their SCADA systems where you actually know when they're on and when they're off, and you can actually correlate that. And then you have pressure sensors that will tell you what the pressure is at the time that these things are on and off, right? And now you have you can put those things together and you get a calculation that has a lot less uncertainty. Now, in some cases, you may want to also corroborate that with some kind of a direct measurement that further reduces your uncertainty. But ultimately, the thing that's going to give your internal stakeholders and external stakeholders confidence that this is working is that picture, right? That says here's my value, here is the measurements upon which it's based, here is the uncertainty, and here's where it comes from. And that's the core of what we build. What we build for our clients, again, is really that validation system that allows you to translate your measurements to records that gets the most out of all the hardware you have. And the interesting thing that it does, in addition to giving you an understanding of your uncertainty from a reporting perspective, and the flip side of your certainty, it also gives you insight as to which areas you need to invest in more hardware, which areas you don't. And which areas you may be over-investing. Like you have some piece of hardware that's, maybe your drone flyover in a particular region is so the data is so noisy, it's actually not valuable at all, and you should just completely ignore it. And that makes companies a lot more efficient with the ultimately limited or not infinite capex budgets they have. And what's interesting is that we've seen, again, across all properties, not just emissions, but it applies to emissions, very counterintuitively, through all the data that we've built out through our system and the analysis, we see roughly 3 overbuilds on instrumentation for every underbuild, which means for every one site that you have, you have an uncertainty, and you could plug that hole with instrument if you manage it properly. We see 3 other sites where someone has bought an instrument and either they put it in the wrong place, or they got the wrong instrument for the wrong purpose, or they're not maintaining it properly, but basically they're getting no value out of it.
Wow, fascinating, especially for a non-technical person like me. This is really, really interesting. Andrew, anything you want to add on measurement, accuracy?
Yeah, I think Ian captured this idea of an emissions factor that the EPA uses, where it's just companies quantify their emissions by basically counting all of the pieces of equipment that they have and then applying a generic factor to that. And we know that typically underestimates methane emissions and misrepresents like the characteristics of methane emissions from a site. And as Ian said, that's not good for reporting and transparent disclosure. It's also bad if you're a company that wants to mitigate its methane emission sources. It could lead you to going after, to deploying capital onto solutions that don't give you the bang for your buck that you're looking for in terms of most tons of methane mitigated for the dollars spent. And I think one of the second part of your question was around sort of, is there a global approach to measurement or reporting? And there is one emerging now. It was announced last year, and it's administered by the United Nations Environment Programme, and it's the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership Reporting Framework. And where this is different and represents a step change for reporting methane emissions from the oil and gas industry is it's the companies that sign up to this are committing to regularly quantify their methane emissions using direct measurement and other strict science-based standards, and moving away from these emission factors. And that companies will also be measuring all of their emissions from all of their production. Why I say that is many companies only report methane emissions from the facilities that they operate. They don't report methane emissions or any emissions from facilities that they own an equity stake in, but another oil and gas company may operate that facility. That kind of gets hidden and disappears off their books. And the third thing that's a bit different about the OGMP 2.0, as it's called, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership Reporting Framework, is there's a standardized reporting template. So the companies that sign up are acquiring their data using a shared set of protocols and inputting it into a shared reporting framework, a reporting template. And this is about 70 companies representing 30% of global oil and gas production have signed up to this protocol so far. And we hope that more and more companies will join. They'll increase the share of direct measurement, increase the share of their methane emissions data that's acquired using quantification methods from drones and flights and satellites and ground-based measurement techniques. And this will be sort of reported annually by the United Nations Environment Programme to add that layer of transparency, not only of the methane emissions, but where have these companies derived their data from.
Fantastic. We have about 15 minutes or so left, and I just want to encourage our audience to throw some questions into the chat room. You have access to this amazing group of experts, and I think this conversation is going a lot of really interesting directions. So I'll, with Ben's help, watch for some questions coming in. But in the meantime, I'm going to open it up to the panel with a little less structure and just the final point is around technology, and we've certainly talked about that already. I guess what I'll say is there anything about technology we haven't said that is important and the audience should hear? And from my own perspective, we just had this amazing conversation around measuring and reporting. I'm wondering if we can move into a little bit around those solutions and what's solvable and what can we see happening with technology to actually reduce emissions once we know what they are. So I'll go open it up, so whoever wants to jump in can just go ahead.
I might start if that's okay.
Super.
I think there's so many trends, and I think Anna can perhaps talk about continuous monitoring. But that is a major trend that I see, because there's an intermittency with methane emissions. So methane emissions go totally unaccounted for because there are these sort of randomly occurring intermittent events, like the tree falls in the forest, but no one's around to hear it. And we've spotted lots of these events in EDF's Permian Map project, where we fly over and see compressors blowing tens of tons of methane per hour into the atmosphere. And if we weren't flying that plane, no one would see it. And its continuous monitors are going to be a critical part of like catching these leaks that nobody can see. The other thing is like there is like an age of satellite technologies that are like accelerating as well. And EDF next year will be launching our own satellite methane sat. And that will be designed to locate and quantify human-generated methane emissions, starting with emissions from the global oil and gas industry. And we hope that this is going to encourage and enable industry and regulators to identify and reduce methane emissions from assets all over the world. And that data will be publicly available. So much greenhouse gas satellite data right now is sort of behind paywalls and really difficult to digest. But methane satellite will have publicly facing data products that will allow a whole bunch of stakeholders, including governments and civil society and industry, to be able to access this. The satellite has a seat on a ride-share rocket, if you will, a SpaceX Falcon 9 with a launch window opening up next October, and is currently being built by Ball Aerospace, who are an outfit in Colorado. So they're currently screwing it all together just now. And just really excited to see how satellites will bring about this new age of accountability and transparency.
Great. There is an audience question kind of related to satellites. So I'm going to pose it and open that up to the panel. So this is from Chris Gonclave's BRG Energy and Climate, asks, is it possible to accurately measure and monitor methane emissions by satellite, or does accurate data require drone and ground level sensors to be reliable? And what level of resolution is needed for purposes of assessing methane emissions, penalties, taxes, or incentives? So sorry, I probably shouldn't have combined those two. So let's focus on the technology aspect of satellites versus ground level and drones.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrew, did you?
I'm going to go to Anna because.
Okay.
Sorry, boys. Yeah, so I think you're asking slightly the wrong question. So accuracy is, one suite of ways to assess a measuring instrument. In this case, the satellites are absolutely accurate. I think a better question is, what is their lower detection limit? So, rather than saying, hey, is the satellite right or wrong? I think we should be asking, what's the smallest level of emission that a satellite can see? And I think satellites are really excelling at, the large emission events that, as Andrew said, is absolutely going to be critical for companies who probably are never going to call up Project Canary in the first place and put out, continuous monitoring, or aren't going to be working with people who might not be aware that they've got, that they would just have like a compressor blowing or a thief hatch open for days at a time. We also think satellites are going to be really, really important in a policy question, particularly holding the sovereigns accountable. Andrew, I know you mentioned what went on with Anji with the next decade announcement. And in particular, I think as we start to impose scrutiny on, the domestic U.S. Oil and gas supply chain, it's going to be probably beneficial for the market to have that same level of scrutiny applied globally. But I would say, accuracy, to answer your question, I think it's going to be important to have a multitude of different measuring techniques. But in order to catch intermittent events and in order to catch small and medium events, of which we find typically there's more of than one might think, and a lot of times they're caused by third-party contractors and like water hauling events, things like that. It's really important to have ground level measurements and to have as much of them as possible.
Great. Ian, do you want to add to what Anna said?
Sure. I guess my guess, if we look at where this measurement technology goes, is that the best solution in many locations, again, I don't think in every location you're going to get the same optimal solution, right? But in many locations, you're going to want to have a correlation between direct measurements that are either going to be intermittent, likely either in space or time, right? If you have a ground-based sensor, it can be continuous in time, but it tends to be focused on a particular area in space, of which you probably can't do infinite ones. And then you have your satellite and your drone-based measurements that are, everywhere in space, but intermittent in time. And I think that you have to correlate those with the lots of data that you already have that may not be directly measuring methane, but are telling you a lot about how your operations are operating, right? So an example, we talked about pneumatic actuators. We could talk about, plunger wells, et cetera, or tank emissions. All these things, you'll have information as to, for example, when the actuator is open or closed, right? And so you want to build a model that says, at this pressure, when the actuator is open, this is how much you're emitting. When it's closed, this is how much you're emitting, and maybe it's half open at this pressure, this is how much you're emitting, right? And then you're going to want to use your intermittent measurements as basically checks against that model. So what you can end up with, and really no different than how you would, again, not to overuse the sulfur analogy, but how you would, let's say, measure sulfur today if you're blending a feedstock at a refinery, right? You'll have some kind of a model or some kind of you'll have a continuous prediction that's telling you what your sulfur is in real time. And the way that and that's leveraging all the data that you have, but not just what the sulfur is, but what you're doing with it, right? Where you're moving things, where it came from, et cetera. And then you're checking and training that model with these measurements that measure directly but are intermittent, again, either in space or time, that would prevent you from building a complete picture with those things on their own. And I think what you're going to see is that sanity check is going to go both ways, right? So your satellite measurements become a sanity check that you have a good operational process model. The flip side is that your operational process model and your system balances are going to become a sanity check on whether your satellite or drone measurements is more likely to be accurate if they disagree with each other, for example. And I think that communication is, it will likely be two-way, and I think it's good that it's two-way.
Great, thanks. I think that answers Chris's question really well. We have a few more questions coming in. This one's for Andrew from Keith Shoemaker, EQT Corp. Would EDF advocate to state and federal governments to establish a methane emissions premium or discount to natural gas prices?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I think we've sort of refrained from sort of talking about differentiated gas markets in terms of price premiums and price reductions so far. And I know that we're sort of building out our thinking about what differentiated gas markets might look like. I think our position right now is that all companies should be there shouldn't be a premium on low emissions gas. All companies should be striving to have low emissions intensity gas and prove it through direct measurement, as EQT has pledged to do through its signature on the OGMP 2.0 framework. And that this demonstrable low emission intensity gas that you're delivering to market gives you basically access to those markets. It allows you to raise finance. It allows you to sort of a social license to operate, and that the minimum bar is basically is demonstrating. But would be happy to chat offline, Keith, about sort of price premium, how you think about price premiums and penalties.
Thanks, Andrew. For the panel, I'll open it up from, this question's from Les Bamber from Sempra. How do we get consistent global standards for methane emissions measurements such that it's acceptable to all buyers?
So maybe if I could, it's kind of like, if I could, my suggestion to, you know, governments, people running these voluntary markets, which might be a little bit contrarian, is I think that ultimately the way that this is likely to work, again, whether it's, you know, through your regulation or voluntary markets or both, right? Regulations like bans that say I can't produce a gas with methane less than X, or carbon pricing schemes where I get a premium for less methane, a discount for more methane, right? In the end of the day, there's going to be two numbers that matter. One is like, what's the minimum threshold or the maximum threshold of emissions below which I can actually, from an economic perspective with today's technology, afford to basically sacrifice all gas production below that level, right? And that kind of becomes my standard, right? It's like your clean fuel standards that you have. You're not allowed to produce above that. Then you're going to want to have another number that you understand, which is the benchmark, right? And that's kind of like, this is what the industry average methane emissions is today. And I'd like to be able to have a system, I think it makes sense, where you can get a premium you can trade at a premium if you're better than that, a discount if you're below that, and potentially even, as we've seen in Alberta and BC and Canada, for example, a subsidy to invest in CapEx to move up the ladder, right? And I think the thing that's kind of counterintuitive that I'd probably suggest is that benchmark. I think there's a temptation to say we shouldn't set up a pricing scheme before we know what the benchmark is. And I think that's actually wrong. I think you want to set the benchmark. You want to guesstimate the benchmark and set the pricing scheme against that, kind of like you're seeing with the voluntary markets. And then use the compliance to that as an incentive to ultimately let companies invest in the measurement that gives you the data that you need to set a more accurate benchmark, and then you change it over time, right? Because like, if you say, I'm going to wait till everybody gets good data before I'm going to set a benchmark and run these incentives, whether it's government carbon pricing or voluntary markets, then you've made your progress dependent on a bunch of people all doing something coordinated at once that they have no incentive or certainty that they can monetize today, right? Whereas as soon as you set a number, even if it's a little bit wrong, you guesstimate it, right? Now you've created a system where every company can measure, get into the system, measure accurately, start to invest in reduction and pay penalties or discounts. Their participation now only depends on actions that they have control over. They're putting measurement in their system. They're reducing in their system, right? And that's just practically a much better way to get everybody measuring well, which is the precursor for you to have a better benchmark, right? And so I think it's a mistake from government and activist perspective to be too hard on industry benchmarks, like to say you're against industry benchmarks today for voluntary markets, for example, because you aren't sure you're accurate. I think that's ultimately short-sighted, because I think that your guesstimated benchmark and getting these markets up and running and these incentives up and running today is the best thing that you can do to accelerate the development of the kind of measurements that you need to make that feedback loop sustain itself in the long term.
Awesome. That's great, Ian. There's so much interest now, lots of questions coming in. We only have a couple of minutes, so I want to give Anna and Andrew some last words. We have one question for Andrew, but Anna, before we get to that, is there anything on global standards you want to say before I move on to Andrew's last question?
Yeah, I would just say to Les that I think acceptable to all buyers is maybe searching for I think that's a world we no longer live in, and I think there's going to be differentiated buyers that have different demands. I think Within the energy industry, we're seeing tremendous differentiation within the energy supply. And I expect sooner rather than later that's coming to, the entirety of the fossil fuel-based energy supply chain. So I would say rather than looking for what's an acceptable benchmark or what's enough, I know this is tough to hear, but the market's going to go up. And the thing that I think is happening in the energy transition is that there's no longer any one simple solution. It's all going to be about continuous improvement and continuous improvement over time. But the good news here is that this is a market in which the highest and best solution wins rather than the lowest cost one. And I think in that world, if you always invest in what's the highest and best fidelity solution, rather than the lowest CapEx one or the lowest cost solution, you're going to be well placed to meet those market demands.
Brilliant. Great wrap-up comment. Andrew, we do have one question from Hugh Gleason from Equinor that I think we can close things off on. So are the trends that we've been discussing here in transparency, third-party verification, continuous measurement enough for EDF and other NGOs?
Yeah, that's a good question, Hugh. And I think EDF as an organization have been sort of concentrating on the issue of data quality for years, and it's great to see industry pledge through initiatives like OGMP 2.0 to go out and dramatically increase the quality, granularity, transparency of their methane emission reporting. But right now, that's what we're discussing right now. And I think what's going to be enough for EDF and other NGOs is let's go from the tell us to the show us. Let's move through, let's demonstrate the use of direct measurement based technology and other methodologies to increase the quality of data. And really show us through initiatives like OGMP 2.0 and others, and through verification of those emissions, whether that's through satellites or, as Ian said, through using multiple layered technologies to reconcile your emission estimates. I think that will be, but the proof will be in sort of the doing and the demonstration of what we're talking about here today.
That's an excellent call to action to end on. I'm going to turn it over to Benna to close things up. But amazing panel. You guys are phenomenal. I'm very optimistic and excited about the future with you three involved. Benna, I'll let you take over.
Thank you so much, Connie. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think it was a really fantastic conversation. I know at the end there came in a lot of questions. Can't answer them all, but it really was great to have all your engagement. Thank you again to Connie, the panelists, for the insightful dialogue, to Validere and Project Canary for sponsoring this event. You will be able to view this discussion here and on our platform, the Energy Dialogues Collaborative platform. So for those of you that would like to learn more about how you can interact and be part of the collaborative, become a member, or of course of any of our upcoming forums and events, you will see below there's a frame for the 2 dates. Our Permian Energy Dialogues is an invitation-only summit. And I know you mentioned briefly about the Permian. Some of this conversation will continue on there. And then, of course, the upcoming North American Gas Forum. Thank you again so much. Until then, thank you for joining the dialogue, and we'll see you next time.